Hi, Elaine here from markergeek.com. Today I've got a fun card to share with you using the Fawn Pivot pop-up die set along with some stamp sets from Mama Elephant. I'm using the Dragon Wishes and Me and My Dragon stamp sets from the recent release, and a couple of stamps from some Stamping Bella sentiment sets do creep in as well, just to finish off the card. And I have included all of the colouring and the card assembly, so I'm showing you how to put together that pivot pop-up mechanism if you haven't seen that before. Firstly, I'm creating some masks for the small dragons, which I'm going to use on the pop-up panel on the inside of the card. As you can see now, I have the pop-up panels there, and I'm using the masks that I've created using Eclipse masking tape to work out the positioning of the images on these panels. And I'm going to stamp them in MFT in extreme black ink. This is Make It Colour blending card, which is my preferred paper for Copic colouring. I am also going to do some Distress Oxide blending on here, which, as I've mentioned in previous videos, does work pretty nicely, even though this isn't my usual go-to card stock for ink blending. The Distress Oxides are creamy enough that they work nicely on it, and when using water to create the background effects, as long as you're fairly conservative and you make sure you dry everything up quickly, it works pretty well and doesn't damage the paper. When the stamping is done, I reapply the masks over the stamped images, ready to do the ink blending. I've chosen 3 colours of Distress Oxide to create a night sky effect: Black Soot, Wilted Violet and Blueprint Sketch, which is one of my favourite combinations of Distress Oxides for creating either galaxies or night skies. As you can see, I'm working on a non-stick craft mat and using the Ranger mini ink blending tools. Because I use the Distress Oxides fairly often, I do keep separate tools for each of the colours, just because I find this nice and quick and easy to work with. I don't like having to keep swapping out the foams each time I change colour. I don't have individual blending tools for all of my Distress inks though, as I use them less often. I do still love the Distress inks, but I just find that I really enjoy working with the Distress Oxides at the moment, and those are the ones that I end up reaching for most often. You will see that a little later that I do end up using some Distress ink on this project as well. I'm using a piece of paper towel here just to stop myself from making finger marks in the ink and getting ink all over my fingers, as the ink hasn't been dried yet, hasn't been heat set. I just find that this is an easy way to work with them, either using a piece of scrap paper or a piece of paper towel just to protect it from finger marks while doing the blending, especially on smaller pieces like this. As I mentioned, when using the water spray, just to add some of those water effects, the oxidation effects with the Distress Oxides, when working on this paper that isn't really meant for use with wet mediums, I'm just really careful to blot the excess water up really quickly and dry with my heat tool straight away. This way you will notice that the paper does kind of raise up. It does get a little bit of a raised texture because you are damaging the surface of the paper with the water, but it dries back really well and the effect is worth it, I think, in the end, because the back of the panels will be visible when the card is opened and closed in the end, so I just wanted it to kind of blend in to the inside of the card and not be a noticeable white, and also it covered up any ink marks that I got on the back of the cardstock. After I finished inking the back of these pieces, I then removed the masks, which is always my favourite part when doing masking and ink blending. It's a little bit like magic. And you will notice that some of the lines get covered up with the ink because Distress Oxide ink has those pigment properties, so it is a little bit opaque. Which means that where my masks weren't perfect, which they never are, the lines have been kind of obscured a little bit. I'm going to fix that when I finish the colouring by using a Copic multi-liner just to go over those lines and make them nice and bold and black again. Before moving on to the colouring, I used some white pigment ink to stamp some of the dragon breath accessory stamps on a couple of the dragons. This ink wasn't as bold as I expected it to be, probably because it's sitting on top of the Distress Oxides and kind of reactivating them a little maybe. But in the end I kind of liked that, as it wasn't too harsh. The effect was kind of nice and soft. I do later on, after I've done the colouring, go in and strengthen it a little with a white gel pen. I decided before doing the colouring that this would also be a good time to add the sentiments on these panels. These are the Stamping Bella sentiments that I mentioned. They were perfect to go along with the sentiment that I finally choose to put on the front of the card. I stamped those with Versamark ink and heat embossed with a white embossing powder. As you can see, I'm just using an anti-static bag on the pieces to prevent that embossing powder from sticking to any wet bits of ink or fingerprints, etc. I'm using my Misty stamping tool to line up the sentiments and get them positioned nicely. I was going to keep the stamping on this card purely Mama Elephant, but unfortunately I didn't really like the way that any of the other sentiments in their in the Dragon Wishes sentiment set fit on these panels, and the Stamping Bella stamps were just the perfect size. They fit perfectly, as you can see. After finishing the heat embossing, I'm going to move on to the Copic colouring of these little dragons. I'm going to show you the Copic colouring for just 2 of them, because otherwise this video would be even longer than it already is. So I'm going to leave you with the colouring and some music and come back to you after I've finished colouring and outlining these little dragons. With the colouring all finished for those inside panels, I decided to move on to creating the panels for the front of my card. I'm using the same Distress Oxide ink colours as I used for the inside panels so that it would be harmonious. And that's Black Soot, Wilted Violet and Blueprint Sketch. And again, I'm using the mini ink blending tools to create a nice blended night sky effect. This time I am working on Strathmore Bristol Smooth Surface paper, which is my preferred paper or card for ink blending. The Distress Oxide inks work beautifully on it. Again, it isn't a paper designed for wet media, so you do still have to be relatively cautious when using water. Again, I am just fairly careful to blot it up fairly quickly and use my heat tool to dry it off. You will find that the effects that you get on different types of paper, whether it be your Copic friendly paper like the Make It Colour blending card or Bristol Smooth Surface, or if you used a watercolour paper, you will find that the effects that you get when applying water will differ. You'll get harsher edges on some papers, you'll get soft diffused effects. So it's really useful to have a good play around with the papers that you have on hand and see which effects you enjoy. I happen to particularly like the effect that I get on the Bristol Smooth Surface paper. With the night sky all blended and complete and with the water applied and all dried off, I then moved on to creating another inked piece, this time, as I mentioned before, using Distress ink in Black Soot to ink another piece of Bristol Smooth Surface paper, which I then die cut using one of the new Mama Elephant Kingdom Trio Creative Cuts dies, which cuts this beautiful mountain range. I chose to use Distress ink rather than Distress Oxide for this piece to get a nice contrast between the mountains and the sky. And I find that the Black Soot Distress ink is a little bolder than the Distress Oxide, especially after you've applied water. With the Distress Oxide, you get that sort of hazy, chalky finish to it. And with the Distress ink, it remains a little bit more vibrant. I also used the Distress ink to ink around the edges of my of both of the panels, the mountain to add some extra definition at the top and around the sides, and also to ink around the edges of the night sky panel so that it all blends in nicely with the front of my card and creates a nice kind of vignette effect around the sky. I do all the die cutting off camera because my die cutting machine is too big to fit on screen. I use the e-bosser from Craftwell, which is an electric die cutting machine. After die cutting the mountain range, I trimmed the edges. As you can see, it's kind of a border die, so it doesn't cut a full piece. So I trimmed the edges down to fit on my card, my night sky panel. And then I have a piece of black sparkle card, which is one of my current favourites from Paper Mill Direct here in the UK. And I'm just arranging all that to make sure it fits. You will then see that I use my Misty stamp tool to position and stamp a sentiment from the Dragon Wishes sentiment set, which, as you can see, goes really nicely with the sentiments that I used on the panel on the inside of the card. Again, I stamp in Versamark ink and heat emboss with a white embossing powder. The embossing powder that I use is the opaque vanilla white regular from Wow Embossing Powder. I really like their embossing powders. I think they work really nicely and they're fairly inexpensive. I used to have an entire drawer filled with different colours and types of embossing powder, but when we moved house I did some decluttering and I hadn't touched most of them for years. So now I really have 4 or 5 different embossing powders, and that's pretty much all I need. Most of the time I only tend to use the white if I want to emboss a white sentiment, or maybe some clear detail embossing powder. As with most things, I got a little bit carried away at some point and thought that I needed every single colour of embossing powder under the sun. But I've realised that no, some things I don't need to have a full set of. Copic markers, yes. Coloured pencils, yes. Paints, yes. Embossing powders, not so much. As you can see, I'm just inking the edges of the cardstock with the Black Soot Distress ink, as I mentioned before, and then I'm going to move on to assembling the pop-up element of the card, putting my main card together. If you would like a better overview of how the pop-up mechanism works, I can recommend also checking out Jennifer Maguire's video. As always, she's done a really comprehensive and clear tutorial on how to put together this pivot pop-up die mechanism. I have left in the footage of putting it all together, but she kind of goes through it and explains things brilliantly. I created a card blank, a card base, from that black sparkle cardstock that I mentioned earlier. It's one of my favourites at the moment. I'm a little bit obsessed with it. I created it so that the black would be on the inside because I wanted a really nice finished look to the inside of the card, as it is one of the main features. So I cut the mechanism, I die cut the mechanism, which I'm showing you now, from that same cardstock so it would blend in. As you can see, it's got score lines, and you fold it along the middle score line and just burnish that with a bone folder. And then there are 2 diagonal lines going across, and you need to fold those in that way towards you on both sides so that they fold in a sort of valley fold. So the first fold that you do is a mountain fold, and then those 2 in valley folds, and then you kind of just manipulate it so that it all comes together into this sort of arrow, and then use your bone folder to just reinforce those folds. And then you apply adhesive. I'm using score tape. You want to use something that's fairly strong. It's going to stand up to being played with a fair amount. So I'm using score tape and applying it to both sides on the top triangles. And then when I'm done with that and I open it back out again, you will see that there is a hole in the middle of the die cut, which you can use to look through and line it up with that score line, with the fold line through the middle of your card base. Taking the adhesive off just one of those triangles, the top one, and then I'm going to line it up and press that down. So lining it up so it's all nice and central, and so that you can see the score line through that hole in the middle, and then pressing that down. And when it is stuck in place, I will fold the mechanism back up and then remove the backing from the tape on the other triangle, and then close the card on that so that it sticks to the bottom piece of the card. And then when that's done, that's the mechanism assembled. And as you can see, having cut the mechanism from the same cardstock as the card base, it all looks really nice and seamless and blends together. Now I've taken the two panels, my two dragon panels, and I'm applying the score tape on those little tabs, which are how they fit together. And then I'm folding along all the score lines to create like a little sort of accordion book almost. Folding those tabs in, removing the backing from the tape, and then lining them up and sticking them together. Now on the mechanism, on the pop-up mechanism, you will see there are a couple of little score marks which are what you will use to line up the center of that pop-up panel. I'm now applying the score tape to those two tabs on either side, the ones that I think Jennifer Maguire described them as looking like arms. This is where the pop-up panels will be stuck to. So I'm doing that, and then you will see that I take that pop-up panel, line up the central line of the pop-up panel where the two panels meet, with the score marks on the center of the pop-up mechanism before pressing it down and adhering it. And once that's in place, you can fold the card up and it's all ready for the outside to be decorated. I will say that it does need to be played with a few times at least, to really get to ease that mechanism. It does catch to start with. The bottom of the pop-up panels kind of keep catching on the card base, but once it's been played with repeatedly, it eases and then works perfectly smoothly. Now you can see that I am adhering the front panels to the front of my card using Fabri-Tac glue from Beacon Adhesives, which is my favourite liquid glue. It's really strong and holds up really well. It's also acid free. I've been using it for almost as long as I've been card making. When the card is all assembled, I then moved on to stamping and masking the dragon and little girl dragon rider from the Me and My Dragon stamp set. I didn't show the process of stamping and masking for this as the video was already quite long. I have included the colouring, however. Basically, I followed the same process as usual. I stamped the dragon on Eclipse masking tape, used that to mask the dragon so I could stamp the little girl. I probably could have skipped that step, but just to be on the safe side, I did the masking. I stamped in MFT Extreme Black ink again on Make It Colour Blending card, and then coloured with my Copic markers. I then outlined the image with a black Copic multi-liner and fussy cut the image to pop up on the front of my card. And that's it really. I chose to colour the dragon using just a fairly smooth blend. He'd also look really awesome coloured with some texture. I might try that next time because I definitely will be colouring these dragons again. You may get sick of seeing them soon. Yeah, it would be quite cool to give him like a scaly look. I just went with a smooth blend on this one, and I chose the orange combination to sort of give a nice contrast with the night sky and the mountains on the front of the card. I think it turned out pretty well. And that is it. I just pop him up on the front of my card using some clear adhesive pads, and that finishes off the card. So I will leave you with the colouring process now. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do like and subscribe. Leave me a comment if you would like. I always enjoy reading them. And I will catch you next time.